In the dusty town of Cedar Ridge, where whispers travel faster than tumbleweeds and secrets are harder to keep than water in a broken bucket, Martha Henderson was about to make a request so shocking that it would turn the entire community upside down. The shy cowboy who barely spoke 2 words to anyone was about to discover that sometimes the most unexpected partnerships can bloom in the most unlikely places. What happens when a grieving widow's desperate plan collides with a lonely man's hidden strength? The answer would shake Cedar Ridge to its very foundations and prove that courage comes in many forms, some quiet, some bold, and some that change everything forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the main street of Cedar Ridge as Thomas McKinnon guided his horse toward the general store. His weathered hat sat low over his eyes, and his shoulders carried the familiar weight of solitude that had become his constant companion over the past 5 years. At 32, Thomas had perfected the art of being invisible in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. He spoke only when spoken to, kept his head down, and minded his own affairs with the dedication of a monk. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge had long since given up trying to draw Thomas into their social circles. They knew him as the quiet cowboy who worked the Morrison Ranch with steady hands and never caused trouble. Children would sometimes stare at him from behind their mothers' skirts, curious about the man who seemed to exist on the edges of their world like a ghost made of dust and leather. But Thomas preferred it that way. Conversation led to questions, questions led to expectations, and expectations led to disappointment. As he dismounted outside Henderson's general store, Thomas noticed the familiar figure of Martha Henderson arranging goods in the window display. Even through the glass, he could see the careful way she moved, as if each gesture was measured against some invisible standard of propriety. Martha had been running the store alone for 8 months now, ever since her husband James had been thrown from his horse and broken his neck in a fall that shocked the entire community. The bell above the door chimed softly as Thomas stepped inside, removing his hat out of habit rather than politeness. Martha looked up from behind the counter, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun that did nothing to soften the sharp intelligence in her green eyes. At 28, she had the kind of beauty that whispered rather than shouted, the kind that revealed itself slowly to those who took the time to look. Thomas nodded briefly in her direction before moving toward the shelves that held farming supplies. He needed new rope and nails for fence repairs, nothing that required conversation beyond stating his needs and counting out payment. But, as he gathered his items, he became aware that Martha was watching him with an intensity that made the back of his neck prickle with awareness. When he approached the counter with his purchases, Martha began tallying his items with unusual deliberation. Her fingers trembled slightly as she wrote each price in her ledger, and Thomas found himself studying her face with growing concern. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and there was a tension around her mouth that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy burdens. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire until Martha finally cleared her throat. Her voice, when she spoke, carried a note of determination that seemed at odds with her obvious nervousness. "Mr. McKinnon," she began, then paused to gather herself before continuing. "I wonder if I might have a word with you privately." Thomas felt his stomach tighten with the familiar anxiety that social interaction always brought. He glanced toward the door, calculating the distance to escape, but something in Martha's expression held him in place. There was desperation there, carefully controlled but unmistakable to someone who had learned to read the subtle signs of distress. "I suppose," he replied quietly, his voice rusty from disuse. Martha moved to the front window and turned the sign from open to closed, then drew the curtains with quick, efficient movements. The action felt significant, like the sealing of a covenant, and Thomas found himself shifting his weight from one foot to the other as uncertainty crept up his spine. When Martha turned back to face him, her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, knuckles white with tension. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, as if the words she needed were too large to fit through the narrow passage of propriety that governed her world. "Mrs. Henderson," Thomas said gently, surprising himself with the concern in his voice. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" The question seemed to unlock something in Martha's carefully constructed composure. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and, for a moment, she looked every one of her years plus several more. "Yes," she whispered, then, louder, "yes, Mr. McKinnon, I am in terrible trouble, and I'm afraid you're the only person in Cedar Ridge who might be able to help me." Thomas felt his eyebrows rise despite himself. In his 5 years in town, he couldn't recall anyone ever seeking his help for anything more complicated than lifting heavy sacks of grain. He was the man people forgot was there, the background figure who existed on the periphery of their lives without impact or influence. Martha began to pace the narrow space behind the counter, her skirts rustling with each step. "I know this is highly irregular," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I know what people will say, what they'll think. But I've examined this from every angle, and I can see no other solution." The weight of her unspoken request hung in the air between them like smoke from a campfire. Thomas found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn into her orbit despite his instinctive desire to flee from whatever complication she was about to introduce into his carefully ordered world. "The bank is going to foreclose on the store," Martha said suddenly, the words rushing out as if she'd been holding them back by force of will alone. "James left debts I didn't know about. Gambling debts, mostly, to men who don't care that I'm a widow trying to make an honest living. They want their money, and, if I can't pay, they'll take the store and everything in it." Thomas felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. Money troubles were serious business in a town like Cedar Ridge, where most people lived close enough to the edge that a strong wind could blow them into poverty. But he couldn't understand why Martha thought he could help. His wages from the Morrison Ranch were steady but modest, certainly not enough to solve the kind of debts that would threaten an established business. "I don't understand, ma'am," he said carefully. "What exactly are you asking of me?" Martha stopped pacing and turned to face him directly, her green eyes blazing with a combination of fear and determination that took his breath away. When she spoke again, her voice was clear and unwavering, each word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. "I'm asking you to marry me, Mr. McKinnon." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow, and he actually took a step backward, his hat falling from nerveless fingers to land on the floor between them. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the weight of her proposal settling over the store like dust after a cattle drive. Thomas stared at her in shock, his mind struggling to process what she'd just said. Marriage was something that happened to other people, people who knew how to talk and laugh and navigate the complicated dance of courtship. It wasn't something that happened to quiet cowboys who kept to themselves and spoke in whispers. "Mrs. Henderson," he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Please, let me explain," she said quickly. "This isn't about love or romance or any of the usual reasons people marry. This is about survival, pure and simple. The bank won't foreclose on a married woman's property if her husband is willing to assume the debts and work to pay them off. You're the only unmarried man in town who doesn't already have obligations that would make such an arrangement impossible." Thomas bent to retrieve his hat, using the moment to try to gather his scattered thoughts. When he straightened, Martha was watching him with an expression that was equal parts hope and terror. "You want a marriage of convenience," he said slowly, testing the words as he spoke them. "Exactly," Martha replied, relief evident in her voice. "A business arrangement, nothing more. You would have a place to live that's more comfortable than the bunkhouse at the Morrison Ranch, regular meals, and a respected position in the community as the proprietor of the general store. In return, you would help me save the business and maintain the fiction of a conventional marriage for the sake of appearances." The logic of her proposal was undeniable, but Thomas felt as if he were standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into an abyss he couldn't fathom. Marriage, even a marriage in name only, would change everything about his carefully constructed life. It would mean conversation, social expectations, the constant presence of another person in his space. But, as he looked at Martha's face, he saw something there that called to a part of himself he'd thought long buried. It was the same desperate courage he'd seen in injured animals, the fierce determination to survive against impossible odds. It was beautiful and heartbreaking and impossible to ignore. "I need time to think," he heard himself saying. Martha nodded quickly, understanding flooding her features. "Of course. This is a great deal to ask, and I know it must come as a shock. But, Mr. McKinnon, I must have an answer soon. The bank has given me until the end of the week." Thomas calculated quickly. It was Tuesday, which meant he had 3 days to make a decision that would alter the entire course of his life. 3 days to weigh the safety of solitude against the terrifying possibility of connection. As he gathered his purchases and prepared to leave, Martha's voice stopped him at the door. "Mr. McKinnon," she called softly. When he turned, she was standing in a shaft of sunlight that made her hair glow like burnished copper. "I want you to know that I wouldn't ask this of you if there were any other way. You're a good man, and you deserve better than to be pulled into my troubles." Thomas studied her face for a long moment, seeing the genuine remorse there alongside the desperation. It occurred to him that in all his years of observing the people of Cedar Ridge from the shadows, he'd never really seen Martha Henderson before this moment. He'd noticed her beauty, certainly, but he'd never seen the steel beneath the softness, the quiet strength that allowed her to run a business alone in a world that expected women to be ornamental rather than useful. "I'll give you my answer Thursday morning," he said finally, then pushed through the door into the bright sunlight beyond. As he mounted his horse and rode back toward the Morrison Ranch, Thomas felt as if he were carrying a live coal in his chest. The weight of Martha's request pressed against his ribs with each breath, and he found himself looking at the familiar landscape with new eyes, as if he were seeing it for the last time. The bunkhouse that awaited him suddenly seemed smaller and lonelier than it ever had before. The silence that had been his companion for so many years felt oppressive rather than comforting. And, somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice he'd thought long silenced began to whisper about the possibility of something more than mere survival. As the sun set over Cedar Ridge, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas McKinnon sat on his narrow bunk and contemplated the most important decision of his life. In the growing darkness, Martha Henderson's green eyes haunted his thoughts, and the words "I'm asking you to marry me" echoed through his mind like a prayer or a challenge. The quiet cowboy who had spent 5 years perfecting the art of invisibility was about to discover that sometimes the most profound changes come not with thunder and lightning, but with the whispered request of a desperate woman who saw in him something he'd never seen in himself. 3 days stretched ahead of him like an eternity, and Thomas knew that whatever choice he made would echo through both their lives forever. The only question was whether he had the courage to step out of the shadows and into the uncertain light of another person's world. The Tuesday evening air carried the scent of sage and distant rain as Thomas walked the fence line of the Morrison Ranch, his usual inspection routine providing little comfort for his churning thoughts. Each post he checked seemed to mock him with its solid certainty, its unwavering purpose. Unlike fence posts, human decisions came with consequences that stretched far beyond the immediate moment, rippling outward like stones thrown into still water. Martha Henderson's proposition played through his mind with relentless persistence. A marriage of convenience. A business arrangement. The words sounded simple enough when stripped of their emotional weight, but Thomas knew that nothing involving two human beings could ever be truly simple. He had seen enough of the world to understand that even the most carefully constructed agreements between people had a way of growing complicated when hearts and lives became entangled. As he worked, memories surfaced unbidden from the depths of his consciousness. He thought of his childhood in Kansas, of the small farm where his parents had struggled to make a living from unforgiving soil. His father had been a man of few words, much like Thomas himself, but those few words had carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Son," his father had said once while they worked together in the barn, "there's two kinds of fear in this world. There's the kind that keeps you alive, and there's the kind that keeps you from living. A smart man learns to tell the difference." At the time, Thomas had been 15 and thought he understood what his father meant. Now, 17 years later, he wondered if he had learned to tell the difference at all, or if he had simply chosen the safety of the first kind of fear and called it wisdom. The next morning brought a crystal-clear dawn that painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Thomas rode into Cedar Ridge with his usual quiet efficiency, but everything felt different now. The familiar streets seemed charged with new possibilities, and he found himself noticing details that had escaped his attention for years. The way the morning light caught in the windows of the general store. The precise way Martha arranged her window display to catch the eye of passing customers. The small sign above the door that read Henderson's General Store in faded but proud letters. He conducted his business at the bank and the feed store with mechanical precision, but his attention kept drifting to the questions that demanded answers. What kind of husband would he make, even in name only? How would the people of Cedar Ridge react to such an unlikely union? And, perhaps most importantly, what would it mean to share his carefully guarded solitude with another person, even if that sharing was built on mutual necessity rather than affection? The answer to that last question troubled him most. Thomas had constructed his life around the principle of minimal human contact, not because he disliked people, but because he had learned early that he lacked the natural ease with words and social situations that seemed to come so naturally to others. He was the boy who had stammered through school recitations, the young man who had watched dances from the periphery, the cowboy who preferred the company of horses to humans because horses never expected clever conversation or smooth social graces. But Martha Henderson was asking for something different. She wasn't asking for charm or wit or the kind of easy companionship that came naturally to more gregarious men. She was asking for reliability, for steadiness, for the kind of quiet strength that could weather storms without breaking. These were qualities Thomas possessed in abundance, even if he had never thought of them as particularly valuable. Wednesday passed in a haze of routine tasks and mounting tension. Thomas found himself paying closer attention to the conversations around him, listening to the way married couples in town spoke to each other, watching the subtle dynamics of partnership that he had never bothered to notice before. What he observed was both reassuring and daunting. Some couples moved together with the smooth efficiency of a well-oiled machine, while others seemed to exist in a state of constant, low-level conflict that made him grateful for his solitude. But there were moments of connection he witnessed that made something deep in his chest ache with longing. A shared glance between the blacksmith and his wife that spoke of years of understanding. The way Mrs. Patterson's hand automatically reached out to steady her husband when he stumbled slightly on the church steps. These small gestures of casual intimacy revealed a world Thomas had only observed from the outside, and he found himself wondering if such easy partnership could exist even in a marriage born of necessity rather than love. That evening, as he sat on the porch of the bunkhouse watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky, Thomas made his decision. It came to him not with dramatic revelation but with the quiet certainty of sunrise, inevitable and right in its timing. He would say yes to Martha Henderson's proposal, not because he was brave, but because he finally understood the difference between the two kinds of fear his father had spoken of so many years ago. The fear of marriage, of change, of stepping into an unknown future, that was the kind of fear that kept a man from living. But the fear of a woman losing everything she had worked for, of standing by while someone who had shown him unexpected kindness suffered alone, that was the kind of fear that should spur a man to action, regardless of his own comfort. Thursday morning arrived gray and overcast, with clouds gathering in the distance like an army preparing for battle. Thomas dressed with unusual care, combing his hair with water and putting on his cleanest shirt. If he was going to accept Martha's proposal, he wanted to do it with dignity befitting the gravity of the moment. The general store was busy when he arrived, with several customers browsing the aisles and Martha moving efficiently between them, answering questions and tallying purchases with the practiced ease of someone who had been born to commerce. Thomas waited near the door, hat in hand, until the last customer left and Martha turned the sign to closed once again. The silence that fell between them was heavy with anticipation. Martha stood behind her counter, hands folded carefully in front of her, and Thomas could see the way her shoulders tensed as she waited for his answer. Her face was composed, but her eyes held a vulnerability that made his chest tighten with protective instinct. "Mrs. Henderson," Thomas began, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "I've given your proposal considerable thought." Martha's hands tightened slightly, the only sign of her nervousness. "And I believe it would be an honor to accept," he continued, watching as relief flooded her features like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Martha smiled, and Thomas was struck by how it transformed her entire face, revealing a warmth and humor that her usual careful composure had hidden. "Thank you, Mr. McKinnon," she said softly. "I know this isn't easy for you, and I want you to understand that I don't take your kindness lightly." "It's not kindness," Thomas replied, surprising himself with his honesty. "It's the right thing to do. And, please, if we're to be married, you should call me Thomas." "Thomas," Martha repeated, as if testing the name. "And you must call me Martha." They spent the next hour discussing the practical arrangements with the businesslike efficiency of two people negotiating a cattle sale. The wedding would be simple, performed by Pastor Williams with minimal ceremony and just enough witnesses to make it legal. Martha would continue to run the general store while Thomas would keep his job at the Morrison Ranch until they could determine whether the store's income would be sufficient to support them both. Living arrangements proved more delicate to negotiate. The store came with a small apartment above it, consisting of 2 bedrooms, a sitting area, and a kitchen. Martha had prepared a spare room for Thomas, she explained, with obvious relief at having anticipated this potential awkwardness. They would maintain separate spaces while presenting a united front to the community and the bank. As they talked, Thomas found himself studying Martha's face with new interest. Without the desperate edge that had marked their previous conversation, she revealed herself to be intelligent, practical, and possessed of a dry humor that caught him off guard. When she mentioned her concerns about Mrs. Whitmore's tendency to spread gossip, her eyes sparkled with mischief that made Thomas almost smile. "She'll have plenty to talk about when she hears about this," Martha said. The mysterious Mr. McKinnon finally caught in the matrimonial net. "I'm not mysterious," Thomas protested mildly. "Just quiet." "In a town like Cedar Ridge, quiet and mysterious are the same thing," Martha replied. "People are going to have theories about this marriage that would curl your hair." The wedding was scheduled for the following Saturday, giving them just 2 days to prepare for a union that would alter both their lives forever. As Thomas prepared to leave, Martha reached into the cash box beneath her counter and withdrew a simple gold band. "This was my grandmother's," she said, holding it out to him. "It's not much, but it will serve for the ceremony." Thomas took the ring, noting its worn smoothness and the way it caught the afternoon light. It felt warm in his palm, weighted with history and significance that went far beyond its modest appearance. "Martha," he said, her name still feeling foreign on his tongue. "I want you to know that while this may be a business arrangement, I intend to honor it as a real marriage in every way that matters. You'll have my loyalty and protection, and I'll do everything in my power to make this work." Martha's eyes softened, and for a moment Thomas glimpsed the woman beneath the careful proprietor's facade, someone younger and more vulnerable than she allowed the world to see. "Thank you, Thomas," she said quietly. "I believe we'll make good partners." As Thomas walked back toward his horse, the ring secure in his pocket, he felt as if he were moving through a dream. In less than 48 hours, he would be a married man, with responsibilities and connections that would bind him to this place and this woman in ways he was only beginning to understand. The transformation had already begun. People nodded to him differently as he passed, as if his pending change in status had somehow made him more substantial, more worthy of notice. Mrs. Patterson actually smiled and bid him good morning, something that had never happened in his 5 years of residence. That evening, Thomas sat in the bunkhouse for what he knew would be one of the last times, surrounded by his few possessions and the memories they contained. Tomorrow he would give his notice to Mr. Morrison, pack his belongings, and prepare to become someone entirely new, not just a husband, but a business partner, a member of the community in ways that would force him to step beyond the comfortable shadows where he had hidden for so long. The prospect should have terrified him. Instead, as he held Martha's grandmother's ring up to the lamplight, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not the wild, desperate hope of youth, but the steady, mature hope of a man who had finally found a purpose worthy of his quiet strength. In marrying Martha Henderson, he wasn't just saving her store or securing his own comfort. He was choosing to believe that two people, however different their circumstances or motivations, could build something worthwhile together. Whether that something would be merely functional or might grow into something deeper remained to be seen. But, for the first time in his adult life, Thomas McKinnon was genuinely curious about what the future might hold. And that curiosity, he realized, was perhaps the most precious gift Martha had given him even before their wedding had taken place. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, with autumn air that carried promises of the winter to come. Thomas stood before the small mirror in the bunkhouse, adjusting his tie for the third time and wondering if this strange nervous energy was what all grooms felt on their wedding day. His reflection showed a man transformed by the simple act of dressing in his best clothes, broader shoulders, steadier gaze, someone who might actually deserve the trust Martha Henderson was about to place in him. Mr. Morrison had taken the news of Thomas's departure with surprising grace, even offering a bonus for his years of faithful service and a standing invitation to return if things didn't work out. The older man's knowing smile suggested he understood more about the arrangement than Thomas had revealed, but his only comment had been a gruff observation that it was about time Thomas found himself a good woman. The ceremony was to take place at 11 o'clock in the small church on the edge of town, with Pastor Williams officiating and just enough witnesses to satisfy legal requirements. Thomas had asked Pete Hendricks from the ranch to stand with him, while Martha had chosen Mrs. Sarah Collins, the banker's wife, whose presence would lend respectability to the proceedings and help quell any rumors about impropriety. As Thomas walked toward the church, his few belongings packed in a worn saddlebag slung over his shoulder, he noticed how the entire town seemed to buzz with quiet excitement. Faces appeared in windows, conversations stopped when he passed, and children followed at a respectful distance as if he were a parade all by himself. The quiet cowboy who had lived on the edges of their community for 5 years was about to become one of its central figures through the simple act of marriage. The church itself was modest, built of weathered wood and good intentions, with windows that caught the morning light and threw it across rows of simple pews. Pastor Williams waited near the altar, his round face beaming with the particular pleasure that ministers took in performing weddings, even ones as unconventional as this promised to be. Martha was already there when Thomas entered, standing near the front pew in a dress of deep blue wool that brought out the green in her eyes. She had pinned her hair up more elaborately than usual, with small pearl combs that caught the light when she turned her head. She looked beautiful and composed and utterly proper, every inch the respectable widow entering into a practical second marriage. But, when their eyes met across the small church, Thomas saw the same mixture of determination and vulnerability he had glimpsed in the general store, and he felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness that had nothing to do with their business arrangement. In that moment, he understood that whatever else this marriage might be, it would never be purely practical for him. Martha Henderson was becoming something more than a business partner, whether either of them had planned for that complication or not. The ceremony itself was brief and efficient, with Pastor Williams keeping his remarks focused on the practical aspects of Christian marriage rather than dwelling on romantic love or passion. Thomas spoke his vows in a clear, steady voice, surprised by how natural the words felt on his tongue. When he slipped his grandmother's ring onto Martha's finger, her hand trembled slightly in his, and he found himself squeezing gently in reassurance. Martha's vows were spoken with the same calm competence she'd brought to running her store, but Thomas caught the slight catch in her voice when she promised to honor and respect him. When she placed a plain gold band on his finger, a ring she had quietly purchased from the town's jeweler the day before, he felt the weight of it like a brand, marking him as someone who belonged to another person in ways both legal and indefinable. The kiss that sealed their union was brief and chaste, more formal acknowledgement than romantic gesture, but Thomas felt the softness of Martha's lips and caught a hint of lavender soap that made him think of Sunday afternoons and quiet domesticity. When they turned to face their small audience as husband and wife, he saw approval and curiosity in equal measure, along with the satisfied expressions of people who enjoyed being present for significant events. Mrs. Collins dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, while Pete Hendricks grinned broadly and pumped Thomas's hand with enthusiasm that suggested he had been hoping for exactly this development for years. Pastor Williams pronounced them blessed in their union and invited the small gathering to the church hall for cake and coffee, an unexpected gesture that touched Martha visibly. The reception was an informal affair, with conversation flowing easily around topics of weather, harvest prospects, and the general state of affairs in Cedar Ridge. Thomas found himself drawn into discussions about store operations and local business conditions, areas where his years of quiet observation suddenly proved valuable. He knew which ranchers were struggling with debt, which families were growing and would need more supplies, which seasonal patterns affected purchasing decisions. Martha watched with obvious surprise as her new husband revealed depths of knowledge about their community that his usual silence had concealed. When Mrs. Patterson mentioned concerns about getting winter supplies ordered in time, Thomas quietly suggested contacting a supplier in Billings who offered better prices and more reliable delivery than their current vendor. When the banker's son asked about opportunities for young men in the territory, Thomas provided a thoughtful analysis of various trades and their prospects that impressed everyone present. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas began to relax into his new role. The weight of wedding ring felt less foreign, the sound of Mr. and Mrs. McKinnon less startling. More importantly, he began to see how he and Martha might actually work together as partners. Her knowledge of people and customer relations combined with his understanding of practical logistics and supply chains could make the general store more profitable than it had ever been under James Henderson's management. When they finally walked together to the store that was now their home, Martha seemed genuinely pleased with how the day had gone. "You surprised me today," she said as they climbed the stairs to the apartment above the store. "I had no idea you knew so much about everyone's business." I listen more than I talk, Thomas replied. People forget I'm there and say things they might not otherwise. Well, it will be valuable in running the store. I've always wondered why certain customers make the purchases they do, but I never had the background to understand their motivations. The apartment was neat and comfortable, with furniture that spoke of careful maintenance rather than abundance. Martha had prepared the spare bedroom with obvious attention to detail: fresh linens, a pitcher and basin for washing, a small desk near the window where Thomas could handle accounts or correspondence. It was more luxury than he had enjoyed since leaving his family's farm, and he felt a surge of gratitude that had nothing to do with their business arrangement. "This is very nice," he said simply. "Thank you for taking such trouble." "We're partners now," Martha replied. "Your comfort is important to the success of our arrangement." But the way she said it, with a softness that hadn't been there during their practical negotiations, suggested that his comfort might be important to her for reasons that went beyond business considerations. They spent the evening going over the store's account books and customer records, with Martha explaining the intricacies of credit arrangements, seasonal ordering patterns, and the various personal relationships that affected business decisions. Thomas found himself fascinated by the complexity of running what appeared to be a simple general store. Every transaction carried emotional and social weight beyond its monetary value, and success depended as much on understanding human nature as on managing inventory. As they worked by lamplight at the kitchen table, papers spread between them and coffee growing cold in their cups, Thomas began to understand what marriage might mean beyond the legal formalities. This sharing of knowledge and responsibility, this comfortable working together toward common goals, it was something he had never experienced but found surprisingly appealing. Martha was an excellent teacher, patient with his questions and generous with explanations that helped him understand not just what to do but why. When Martha finally declared them finished for the evening, Thomas realized they had spent 3 hours in easy conversation without a single awkward pause or moment of social uncertainty. The business focus had allowed him to forget his usual self-consciousness about talking, and Martha's genuine interest in his observations had drawn him out in ways that surprised them both. "I think this is going to work very well," Martha said as she gathered the papers into neat stacks. "You have insights about the business that I never considered, and you ask exactly the right questions." "You're a good teacher," Thomas replied. "I never understood how complicated storekeeping could be." "Most people don't," Martha agreed. "They see the simple transactions but miss all the relationships and calculations that make them possible." As they prepared to retire to their separate bedrooms, an awkward moment of uncertainty arose. They were married now, sharing a home and a business, but they were still essentially strangers navigating the boundaries of their unusual arrangement. Thomas found himself unsure of the appropriate level of formality, while Martha seemed to struggle with similar questions. Finally, Martha broke the silence with characteristic directness. "I think we should establish some routines," she said. "Breakfast at 7, dinner at 6. We'll take turns with cooking duties, though I should warn you that my culinary skills are strictly practical. And I think we should continue to use given names rather than formal address. It will seem more natural to customers and neighbors." "That sounds sensible," Thomas agreed, grateful for her practical approach to their domestic arrangements. "Good night then, Thomas," Martha said, her use of his name still sounding slightly experimental. "Good night, Martha," he replied, and was surprised by how right it felt to say her name in the context of their shared home. As Thomas prepared for his first night as a married man, he reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. 3 days ago, he had been a solitary cowboy with no prospects beyond his next paycheck. Tonight, he was a husband, a business partner, and a respected member of the community with responsibilities and opportunities he was only beginning to understand. The bed was comfortable, the room quiet and peaceful, but sleep eluded him as his mind raced with all the changes that marriage would bring. Beyond the practical matters of running the store and maintaining their arrangement, he found himself curious about Martha herself, her thoughts, her dreams, the experiences that had shaped her into the remarkable woman who had possessed the courage to propose such an unconventional solution to her problems. In the darkness, he could hear Martha moving quietly in her own room, and he wondered if she was experiencing similar thoughts about their future together. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Thomas felt more optimistic about facing them than he had felt about anything in years. For the first time since leaving his family's farm, he had found a place where his particular combination of quiet strength and careful observation was not just accepted but valued. The shy cowboy who had spent 5 years perfecting the art of invisibility was learning that sometimes the most profound transformations begin not with dramatic gestures but with simple acts of faith, the willingness to say yes when life offers unexpected possibilities for connection and purpose. The first weeks of marriage passed in a whirlwind of adjustment and discovery that surprised both Thomas and Martha with its relative smoothness. What they had expected to be an awkward arrangement of mutual convenience slowly revealed itself to be something more complex and infinitely more rewarding than either had dared to hope. Thomas proved to be a natural at the business side of storekeeping, with an intuitive understanding of inventory management that came from years of managing supplies on the ranch. He quickly identified items that moved slowly and suggested alternatives that better matched customer needs. His quiet observations of shopping patterns revealed opportunities Martha had missed, the way ranchers' wives always bought certain items together, the seasonal fluctuations that could be anticipated and planned for, the subtle signs that indicated when a family was struggling financially and might need extended credit terms. More importantly, his presence in the store changed its entire atmosphere. Where customers had once hurried through their transactions with polite sympathy for the struggling widow, they now lingered to discuss business conditions, seek advice on practical matters, or simply enjoy the comfortable environment that emerged when two capable people worked in harmony. Thomas's reputation for honest dealing and sound judgment, built over years of quiet consistency, transferred seamlessly to the general store and brought with it a level of trust that translated directly into increased sales. Martha, for her part, proved to be an excellent business partner who appreciated Thomas's contributions without feeling threatened by them. She had the social skills and customer relationships that he lacked, while he brought the analytical thinking and practical experience that complemented her natural abilities perfectly. Together, they developed a system of silent communication that allowed them to handle even difficult customers with unified efficiency. But it was the domestic side of their arrangement that provided the greatest surprises. Both had expected the sharing of living space to be the most challenging aspect of their marriage, but instead it became its greatest reward. Martha was a considerate housemaid who respected Thomas's need for quiet and solitude, while Thomas's natural helpfulness around the apartment freed Martha from many of the burdens that had weighed on her as a widow managing alone. Their evening routine of reviewing the day's business while sharing simple meals evolved into something that felt remarkably like companionship. Thomas discovered that Martha had a sharp wit and a talent for storytelling that emerged once she felt comfortable enough to let her guard down. Martha learned that beneath Thomas's quiet exterior lay a thoughtful intelligence and a dry humor that revealed itself in unexpected moments. The breakthrough in their relationship came on a busy Saturday afternoon in late October when a situation arose that tested both their partnership and their growing trust in each other. The Weatherby family, struggling ranchers from the far end of the valley, came to the store with their usual order but without the cash to pay for it. James Henderson had carried them on credit before, but the debt had grown to a size that made Martha nervous about extending it further. Thomas watched from behind the counter as Martha struggled with the decision, seeing her torn between compassion and practical necessity. The Weatherbys waited with the particular kind of dignity that comes from pride tested by circumstances beyond one's control, while their 3 young children stood quietly beside their parents, old enough to understand that this transaction was about more than simple commerce. When Martha glanced at him with uncertainty, Thomas made a decision that surprised them both. He stepped forward with quiet authority and began tallying the Weatherbys' order, but instead of adding to their existing debt, he structured the transaction as a work arrangement. Mr. Weatherby could provide labor for some improvements Thomas had been considering for the store building, with the value of his work applied against both the current purchase and the outstanding debt. The solution was elegant in its simplicity and fair to all parties, but what struck Martha most was the way Thomas had stepped forward to support her decision-making without undermining her authority. He had seen her dilemma, understood the competing pressures she faced, and offered a solution that preserved everyone's dignity while protecting the store's interests. Later that evening, as they reviewed the day's transactions, Martha brought up the incident with obvious emotion. "What you did today with the Weatherbys," she began, then paused as if searching for the right words. James never would have thought of that solution. He would have either refused them credit or extended it without any security, but he never would have found a middle path that helped everyone. Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks at the praise. It seemed like the right thing to do, he said quietly. It was the right thing to do, Martha replied firmly. But, more than that, it was brilliant. You saw a way to turn a bad debt into productive labor while preserving their dignity. That's exactly the kind of thinking that will make this business successful. The acknowledgement of his contribution meant more to Thomas than he could express. For the first time in his adult life, someone was not just accepting his help but recognizing the value of his unique perspective. It was a feeling that went far beyond business partnership and into territory that made him distinctly uncomfortable with its implications. As autumn deepened into winter, their working relationship continued to evolve in ways that brought them closer together. The store became a gathering place for the community during the long, cold evenings, with customers lingering to warm themselves by the stove and share news from their scattered homesteads. Thomas found himself drawn into these informal social gatherings, his quiet presence providing a calming influence that encouraged others to speak freely. It was during one of these evening conversations that Thomas first heard Martha really laugh, with genuine delight rather than polite amusement. Someone had told a story about a mishap involving a runaway pig and the town's pompous banker, and Martha's response was a sound of pure joy that transformed her entire face and made Thomas's chest tighten with an emotion he didn't dare examine too closely. The moment passed quickly, but its impact lingered. Thomas found himself watching for opportunities to see that expression again, paying attention to the kinds of stories and observations that brought out Martha's natural humor. He began contributing his own dry comments to conversations, rewarded when Martha's eyes sparkled with appreciation for his understated wit. Their domestic routines also deepened during these weeks. Martha proved to be an excellent cook when she had time to focus on it, and Thomas discovered a talent for bread-making that surprised them both. Their morning conversations over coffee became a cherished ritual, a quiet time when they could discuss the day's plans without the interruptions of customers or business concerns. But it was the evening hours that Thomas treasured most. After the store closed and the day's receipts were tallied, they would sit by the fire reading or working on small projects, comfortable in each other's presence in a way that felt both natural and miraculous to someone who had been alone for so many years. Sometimes Martha would mend clothes while Thomas worked on repairs around the apartment. Other evenings, she would read aloud from books or newspapers while he listened and occasionally offered thoughtful comments on what he heard. The physical attraction that neither had acknowledged was growing stronger with each passing day. Thomas found himself acutely aware of Martha's presence in ways that had nothing to do with their business partnership. The sound of her voice, the way she moved around their shared space, the occasional accidental brush of her hand against his when they reached for the same item, all of it combined to create a constant, low-level awareness that both thrilled and terrified him. Martha seemed to be experiencing something similar. Thomas caught her watching him sometimes with an expression he couldn't quite interpret, and there were moments when their conversation would falter for no apparent reason, leaving them looking at each other with a mixture of curiosity and something that might have been longing. The crisis that would test their growing bond came in early December, when word reached Cedar Ridge that James Henderson's gambling debts were larger than anyone had suspected. A group of creditors from Billings arrived in town demanding immediate payment, armed with legal documents that threatened not just the store but everything Martha owned. The lead creditor, a hard-faced man named Morrison who bore no relation to Thomas's former employer, made it clear that he considered the recent marriage a transparent attempt to protect assets from legitimate debts. He demanded full payment within a week or he would seize not just the store but the apartment above it, leaving Thomas and Martha with nothing. Martha's composure cracked for the first time since Thomas had known her. That evening, after the creditors had left with their ultimatums, she sat at their kitchen table and wept with the terrible despair of someone who had fought as hard as possible only to face inevitable defeat. Thomas watched her tears with growing fury at the injustice of the situation. Martha had worked tirelessly to honor her dead husband's obligations, had sacrificed her own comfort and security to maintain the store's reputation, and now she faced losing everything because of debts she had never incurred or even known about. But, more than fury, he felt a deep, protective love that he could no longer deny or rationalize as mere partnership. Somewhere in the weeks of shared work and quiet companionship, Martha Henderson McKinnon had become the most important person in his world, and he would not stand by while she lost everything that mattered to her. When Martha finally lifted her head and apologized for her tears, Thomas reached across the table and took her hands in his. Her skin was soft and warm, and he could feel the slight tremor that spoke of exhaustion and fear. "Martha," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to propose. "How much do they want?" $800, she whispered. "It might as well be 8,000. We don't have anything close to that amount." Thomas nodded slowly, his mind already working through possibilities that would have been unthinkable just weeks before. "What if we did have it?" he asked. "What if I told you I could get that money?" Martha stared at him in confusion. "Thomas, I know what you earn. There's no way you could have saved that much." "Not saved," Thomas agreed. "But I have something I could sell. Something worth enough to pay those debts and give us a fresh start." The something Thomas was thinking of was the one valuable thing he owned, a section of land in Kansas that his father had left him. It was good farmland, well-watered and fertile, and Thomas had been holding on to it as his insurance against an uncertain future. Selling it would mean giving up his safety net, committing himself entirely to this new life with no possibility of retreat. But, as he looked at Martha's tear-stained face and felt the weight of her hands in his, Thomas knew that he had already committed himself completely. Somewhere between saying "I do" and learning to laugh at her stories, he had stopped thinking of their marriage as a temporary arrangement and started thinking of it as the foundation for the rest of his life. The shy cowboy who had spent years avoiding emotional entanglements had discovered that love, when it came, was not the gradual, cautious emotion he had expected, but something that arrived with the force of a spring flood, reshaping the entire landscape of his heart in ways both wonderful and terrifying. The decision to sell his father's land in Kansas was one that Thomas made with his heart rather than his head, and the magnitude of what he was sacrificing didn't fully hit him until he was sitting in the telegraph office composing a wire to a land agent in Topeka. With each carefully chosen word, he was severing his connection to his past and betting everything on a future he had never imagined possible just months before. Martha had tried to talk him out of it, of course. When he had explained about the land and its value, she had protested with tears in her eyes that she couldn't allow him to give up his inheritance for debts that weren't his responsibility. But Thomas had been firm in his decision, and gradually Martha had come to understand that this was about more than financial obligation or even partnership. This was about love, though neither of them had spoken that word aloud. The telegraph response came back within 2 days, confirming that the land could be sold quickly to a buyer who had been interested for some time. The price would be enough to pay the creditors, settle the store's remaining debts, and leave a small cushion for improvements and expansion. Thomas felt a pang of loss when he signed the papers that would transfer ownership, but it was overwhelmed by relief at seeing the hope return to Martha's eyes. The confrontation with Morrison and his associates was brief and businesslike. Thomas presented the certified bank draft with quiet dignity, watching as the hard-faced creditor's expression shifted from smug anticipation to grudging respect. Legal documents were signed, debts were marked as satisfied, and the threat that had hung over their heads like a storm cloud finally dissipated. But the most significant moment came after the creditors had left, when Thomas and Martha found themselves alone in the store that was now truly theirs, free and clear of all encumbrances. Martha stood in the center of the main aisle, turning slowly to take in every corner of the space that represented her livelihood and her independence. "I don't know how to thank you," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't need to thank me," Thomas replied. "This is our store now, our life. I did what any husband would do to protect what matters most." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Martha looked at him with an expression that was part gratitude, part wonder, and part something deeper that made Thomas's pulse quicken. "Thomas," she said softly, "when I asked you to marry me, I thought I knew exactly what I was asking for. A business arrangement, a practical solution to a desperate problem. But this..." She gestured around the store, then, at the space between them. "This isn't what I planned at all." "No," Thomas agreed, taking a step closer to her. "It's something much better." The conversation that followed was the most important of their marriage, the moment when they finally acknowledged what had been growing between them for weeks. They talked about the unexpected comfort of shared domesticity, the way their individual strengths had combined to create something neither could have achieved alone. They discussed the subtle shift from partnership to something deeper, the gradual erosion of the careful boundaries they had established. Most importantly, they talked about love, the word that had been lurking beneath the surface of every interaction, every shared glance, every moment of easy companionship. It had crept up on them both, as quiet and persistent as Thomas himself, transforming their practical arrangement into something rich with possibility. When Thomas finally found the courage to take Martha's hands and tell her that he loved her, her response was everything he could have hoped for. She had been fighting the same feelings, the same growing attachment that threatened to complicate their careful arrangement. But the events of the past week had shown her that their marriage was already far beyond the realm of mere convenience. The kiss they shared was nothing like the brief, formal acknowledgement at their wedding ceremony. It was soft and tentative at first, then deeper as years of loneliness and careful self-protection gave way to the joy of genuine connection. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless and slightly stunned by the intensity of their own emotions. "I love you too," Martha whispered against his cheek, and Thomas felt as if the sun had suddenly emerged from behind storm clouds that had been darkening his world for years. The transition from marriage of convenience to marriage of love was not without its challenges. They had to learn to navigate physical intimacy, emotional vulnerability, and the thousand small adjustments that come with truly sharing a life rather than simply coexisting. But they approached these challenges with the same practical wisdom and mutual respect that had characterized their business partnership. Christmas that year was the first either of them had celebrated with genuine joy in longer than they could remember. Martha decorated the apartment with pine boughs and ribbon, while Thomas surprised her with a music box he had ordered from a catalog, a small luxury that represented hope for beauty and joy in their shared future. Their gift exchange was intimate and meaningful, each present chosen with careful attention to the other's interests and needs. The store thrived under their joint management in ways that exceeded their most optimistic projections. Word of their honest dealing and helpful service spread throughout the territory, drawing customers from ranches and settlements that had previously done business elsewhere. Thomas's innovations in inventory management and customer credit combined with Martha's social skills to create an operation that was both profitable and respected. But, more importantly, they had created something neither had expected when they first entered into their arrangement, a genuine partnership built on love, respect, and mutual admiration. Their differences in temperament and background became strengths rather than obstacles, each providing what the other needed to flourish. Thomas learned to express himself more freely, encouraged by Martha's genuine interest in his thoughts and observations. His natural shyness never completely disappeared, but it evolved into a thoughtful reserve that people found trustworthy rather than off-putting. He became a respected voice in community discussions, sought out for his practical wisdom and honest assessments. Martha, for her part, discovered that the security of Thomas's steady support allowed her to take risks and pursue opportunities she would never have dared attempt alone. She expanded the store's services, added new product lines, and developed relationships with suppliers that gave them advantages over competitors in larger towns. Their home above the store became a gathering place for friends and neighbors, a warm and welcoming space that reflected the happiness of the couple who lived there. Martha's cooking improved dramatically when she had someone to cook for who genuinely appreciated her efforts, while Thomas's quiet presence made everyone feel comfortable and valued. The first anniversary of their wedding was celebrated not with the relief of having survived a difficult year, but with genuine gratitude for the unexpected gift they had found in each other. They hosted a small dinner for the friends who had supported them, and Pastor Williams offered a blessing that recognized the transformation their marriage had undergone. As they stood together in the store that had brought them together, Thomas reflected on the journey that had led him from a lonely cowboy afraid of human connection to a man surrounded by love and purpose. The shy boy who had stammered through school recitations had become someone whose words carried weight and whose opinion was valued by the entire community. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was in how he saw himself. Where once he had believed that his quiet nature made him unsuitable for the complex demands of marriage and partnership, he now understood that his particular combination of thoughtfulness, reliability, and careful observation were exactly what Martha needed. More than that, they were qualities that made their relationship stronger and more fulfilling than either could have achieved with someone more conventionally charming but less fundamentally solid. Martha's bold request had indeed shocked the shy cowboy, but not in the way either of them had expected. Instead of simply providing a solution to her immediate problems, it had revealed possibilities neither had dared to imagine. Their marriage of convenience had become an extraordinary love story, proof that sometimes the most profound connections grow not from passion or romance, but from the patient cultivation of respect, trust, and genuine partnership. The general store continued to prosper, becoming not just a business but a cornerstone of the Cedar Ridge community. But, for Thomas and Martha McKinnon, their greatest success was not measured in profits or social standing, but in the quiet satisfaction of two people who had found in each other the perfect complement to their individual strengths and weaknesses. Years later, when young people in the community spoke of their relationship as an example of true partnership, Thomas would smile and remember the desperate woman who had shocked him with an impossible request. Martha's courage in proposing their marriage had given them both far more than either had asked for, a love that proved that the best arrangements of the heart are those that grow naturally from mutual respect, shared purpose, and the willingness to see in another person not just what they are, but what they might become when they find their proper place in the world. In the end, the shy cowboy and the determined widow had discovered that love comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most enduring marriages are built not on the shifting sands of passion, but on the bedrock of two people committed to making each other's lives better in every way possible.